All right, hi everyone. We're going to get started. Are we going to close the doors, keep them open? Okay. Well, welcome to today's session, Bridging Divides, Advancing Climate Action Through Policy, Faith, and Public Engagement. My name is Sanjay. I'll be moderating today's conversation. So currently I serve as Deputy Commissioner for Climate, Air, and Energy at the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. And we're going to go down the row today and ask folks to introduce themselves, ideally with something about themselves, not necessarily just their professional. So we're really just going to dive in. We have about 45 minutes. And we'll start with George. George, who are you? What are you up to?
George Behrakis, Climate Solutions Fund. We're working to try and make climate a bipartisan issue on the federal level. We do that by engaging a range of stakeholders and partners in philanthropy, inside the conservative movement, and members of Congress on both sides of the aisle. I'll talk more about myself. I came to the environmental topic not in a traditional way. I came at it through a political lens, wanting to solve a political problem. And so I like thorny problems. And my background is in politics, so that's what originally sort of drew me to the issue. I think became more passionate about the environment after I got involved in environmental advocacy. So I'll keep it short and sweet.
Great, thanks, George. Danny?
Testing, yes, okay. Hi, I'm Danny Marquez. I grew up in West Texas, which is oil and gas country, also football country. Great for a gay boy that hates sports. And so growing up, there was pump jacks all over the place. Oil and gas was prolific. My family and friends are all tied to kind of oil and gas, so it was interesting to kind of grow around that. Post-college, I went to go work in the oil and gas industry, spent 4 years there. And then I went to go work on a power project in Chad, converting flare gas to power. And both of those experiences taught me a lot about the role that energy plays in society. The experience in Chad kind of taught me how energy accessibility, energy affordability can have such a impactful change on society, and a lot of things that I took for granted here in the United States that I didn't realize until I was in a country with 11 megawatts for 11 million people, which is a tiny, tiny amount. So now I've spent the last 8 years working on climate from an electric vehicle transportation perspective. Looking forward to the chat today.
Thanks, Danny. Jessica?
Hi, folks. Jessica Moerman. I serve as president and CEO of the Evangelical Environmental Network. And what we do in a nutshell is try to solve climate change by mobilizing the evangelical community to do so. Sometimes I like to say I'm a glutton for punishment and talk about thorny problems. No, why do we do that? Because we think about our faith communities. They are places where they're coming to gather and learn something every week, not just for learning's sake, but to be mobilized to action and for the betterment of their community. And so it's a really powerful constituency to mobilize for this issue. Before coming to EN, I'm a climate scientist by training. I'm a climate scientist because of my faith. And again, making those connections of faith values, of stewarding, as we term in our faith tradition, God's creation, and protecting, loving our neighbor, recognizing that for climate, it's the most vulnerable who are hit first and worst. That was my motivation for getting into the climate field, came through that, through the climate science, climate research. But for me, it's really become personal. It's not just a thing that I studied or a field that I work in, but it's become something very personal for me. Back in 2016, we lost a family home in East Tennessee, also football country. But we lost a family home in a wildfire in East Tennessee. I'm also the mother of 2 boys, and one was born during the historic 2021 heat wave, really seeing those impacts of heat stress on my newborn child. My other son was, while I was pregnant with him, we lived next to a 12-lane highway. Didn't realize that I was breathing in those traffic emissions day and night. I now know in my work that being exposed to traffic emissions, to soot, particle pollution can be linked to different medical conditions, including ADHD. My oldest child has been diagnosed with ADHD, and so it's those personal things that really motivate me in this work as well.
Thank you, Jessica. Aruni.
Yes. Hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Aruni Ranaweera, and I come into this work for most of my life having lived very close to the water. I was born in Sri Lanka. My family, lived very close to the beach. We then immigrated to the United States. We lived in Michigan, a brief stint in Indiana. I wasn't near the water, but then lived in Houston and New York and Boston. So I think just having lived so close to the water, I've grown up with a connection to it and an appreciation for it and a respect for it, and now a growing fear of the water and seeing really how sea level rise and storm surge is really going to change our communities. If you've ever stood in front of a wave and watched it come at you, you should probably be, I'm very afraid for what's going to happen to our communities over the next few decades and what's happening now. So I approach climate work from a passion for resilience. My professional background's in community organizing at the local level and helping communities prepare for climate change in their neighborhoods, both through parks and green infrastructure, as well as preparing for reducing traffic emissions and other kinds of pollutants that people are experiencing. So my passion for climate work really is the community impacts and how we can do local change to protect our communities.
Great. Well, you can see we have a really cool panel up here, and we have a topic that's kind of essential to climate work today, right? We had some interesting decisions happen, right? Where a lot of the things that folks like myself who were working in the Biden administration at the time pushed a lot of climate policy forward that has since been pulled back. And so we're at a moment where it's easy to be kind of doom and gloom in the climate space. Everyone's playing defense. Everyone's not sure what's next, but we all know this is a ticking clock. We have a certain amount of time to get this work done. That can be really stressful. So what I want to start with today is actually what's working, because the story is not only doom and gloom. There's obviously a lot of challenges that we face to get this work done. But first, I'd like to start with just what's working. And why don't we start with Aruni first? So help us see, I mean, you've been really active at the community level. You've worked with park systems. You've even worked in DC. Tell us a little bit about what's working from your perspective.
Yeah, I will say what's working really is community capacity for what it means to prepare for extreme events, extreme flooding, extreme heat. This past summer, I was living in New York, and it happened to be election day, and there was a huge heat wave that came, and a lot of people were outside in their neighborhoods because they were either voting or, like me, I voted early, I was working the polls. And it was an extremely hot day, and the city was aware that people would be outside during the heat wave. And so I was inundated with information about how to prepare for a heat wave. I got on the subway ad said, it's a heat wave today, here's how you prepare, here's how you know that you're experiencing extreme heat. I opened up Instagram, like all the city council members I followed and community organizations I followed were posting about the heat wave. I got to the poll site volunteer had water bottles and snacks and went into this very prepared speech about how to know I'm experiencing heat suffering. And it just seemed like there was such a broad awareness for how to prepare at the very local level, and everyone was doing their part. And that's not because of the Inflation Reduction Act. That was just because it was hot outside, and it's been hot outside, and people have been preparing. And I would say compared to 2 years ago, that was not the case. There have been heat waves in New York City before, and you just kind of go outside and kind of deal with it. And it was kind of great to see that the community capacity had built, not just at the organizational level, but also that the city was supporting residents in getting there. The city was, they're responsible for the subway ads. They're responsible for giving out the flyers to community organizations so that they can give them out to their residents. So I think local governments and communities are stepping up to prepare residents for being protected from the health hazards that are going to come from these extreme events. I was just at a flood resilience fair in Queens organized by a local reporter called The City Sponge. He does a blog about how people can prepare for flooding, and he had organized all these vendors to come to a community center in Queens and share about how you can prepare for your upcoming flooding event in your neighborhood. That was, and then residents just came in and learned about how they can flood-proof their basements and how they can apply for a different type of insurance that could make them more prepared. So these local solutions are popping up all over the place, and city governments and state governments are helping to get those resources out and to provide funding for these local efforts, because local community organizations can't be expected to take on the brunt of this by themselves without any funding. And it's not equitable to expect communities to just be able to self-support. So I think it's about local efforts and then government support for those local efforts.
Great, thanks, Aruni. Jessica, your organization has really served as a bridge in many ways between parts that sometimes are hard to pull together, and y'all managed to do it. What's been working for you?
Yeah, I'd say one of the key things that's been working for us with our outreach has been taking climate out of the political sphere, not framing it as a political issue because that's where it gets polarized, but for us, connecting with those faith values, rooting it back into scriptural mandates of, again, caring for creation, loving neighbor. And what we found really works is when we're able to get down to that level, and as we're able to connect with the faith leaders that we serve, help them to see how a climate solution can help them, can enhance how they serve the people, the communities, the places, and the problems they've been called to address in their ministry, how that helps to, a climate solution can help with that. We're seeing a lot of resonance. So it's a lot in the framing of reframing, rethinking about climate and climate solutions afresh. And again, why I think the faith community is such a powerful constituency to connect with, tap into, is they're used to addressing faithfully and consistently really big problems. Problems of poverty, problems of hunger, problems of health. And so something large like this, like climate, is something that, and especially that you have to address at all different scales, is something well suited for the faith community. And so we're seeing as our faith leaders and faith members are beginning to make that connection. They're living it out in their daily lives. At the household level of, Scripture calls us to steward the garden. Well, we all may not have our own gardens these days, but what does it look like to steward our household in a way that is sustainable? They're walking the walk that way, scaling that up in their own churches of how facilitating their houses of worship through energy efficiency upgrades, going solar. Our Christian farmers that we connect with, who are called, one, to be good land stewards, and then also deep desire to pass that family farm, keep it strong, to pass it down to the next generation, discovering how climate smart practices and regenerative agricultural practices can keep them more resilient to climate-related disasters such as drought and flood, but also bring in new income streams. Again, making that faith connection as a faith motivator has been really working well with bringing new people into advocating for and putting in place climate solutions.
Great. Thank you both. So Danny, you've worked on fleet electrification at Amazon and Walmart. You've had experience working in the oil and gas industry, so you've seen this from a lot of different angles. What's working on the business side?
Yeah, I'd say from the power generation perspective, which is roughly 25% of U.S. emissions, you see a lot of growth in renewables over the last decade. You've seen the costs come down for solar, for storage, for wind, for batteries. So I think what that tells me is that the technology is maturing, companies are adopting, and it's proliferating throughout the U.S. economy. From a transportation perspective, which is roughly 28% of emissions, those emissions come from air transport, from boats. I'm going to focus in on the 80%, which is roughly the land transportation. So that's class 1 to class 8 vehicles. Class 1 vehicles are like passenger vehicles, the cars that you drive. Class 8 vehicles are like semis, 18-wheelers. And what I've seen at Amazon and at Walmart is on the class 1 side, the class 2 side, the light duty vehicles, from a total cost of ownership, from a TCO perspective, you can already see that those vehicles, depending on how you operate them, they're already at par, if not less expensive to operate than a gas combustion engine. That's phenomenal because as the teams that I was working on internally at Walmart, a lot of the messaging that we did initially, particularly when I was at Amazon, was around sustainability or around reducing emissions. And while the core business and Amazon and Walmart as a corporate wanted to push those goals forward, they have publicly stated emissions goals. Cost was always a key consideration. And being able to showcase the business case that it's actually less expensive and you're going to save cost over time by operating an electric vehicle, that kind of sold itself to the business and allowed us to deploy a lot more electric vehicles and proliferate across the business. So that piece I find fascinating on the class 8 space. That's a heavy duty space. That's a little bit further behind, probably 5-ish years behind the class 1 space. You need much bigger batteries to travel much further distances. But even on that one, there's already some of the EV OEMs, particularly the like Teslas of the world, who have products out in the market that can meet some of those long range constraints for the Amazons and the Walmarts of the world. So again, what that tells me is it's the technologies within striking distance of being able to be implemented and then just proliferate throughout the operations of all these different types of companies.
Great, thanks, Danny. And so, George, you work in the kind of center-right space of climate policy, and what we've noticed, right, is that not everything from the IRA is gone. There's some things that were actually durable. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about like what sticks and why does it stick? How do we have more durable climate policy?
Yeah. I just want to, before I say that, I think it's important to acknowledge in the political space, there's not a lot that's going well beyond just climate. Yeah, it's a little bit.
Our politics is very challenging right now, and certainly on this issue, it's very challenging to work in. But one of the silver linings is that if you do look at the IRA, some of the tax credits and provisions that are going to do the most for innovation in not this decade, but in the coming decades, were actually preserved. Nuclear, geothermal, things, very specific technology-specific tax credits. And why were those preserved? There's a few different reasons, some of which we'll actually get to later on when we discuss why other things didn't make it, but these are things that were able to sort of skirt away from the culture wars. There was also a lot of mobilization that happened in the center-right climate space, putting messengers from the business community out in front of these members of Congress, explaining the economic logic, the national security logic, the competitiveness logic for some of these tax credits. So certainly, the story of the IRA that you see in sort of the mainstream climate conversation and in the press is that a lot of the funding was rolled back. Solar and wind are going to have a very tough time. Those things are true, but actually underneath the hood there is a lot more nuance, and there were some things preserved. And I think it is a small silver lining in the sense that it shows us that when there is advocacy and mobilization that happens with messengers that can speak credibly to conservative members of Congress, there is a pathway to sort of preserving some of these policy wins.
Great, thank you all. So we've heard a little bit of the local perspective of, catching people where they live, understanding that big things happen at the national scale, but actually local communities are driving forward on climate action. We've heard, the progression that you can have with faith communities when you ground in values and move towards climate versus trying to pull people to politics that feels a little poisoned at this point from their perspective. We've heard that the business community actually is seeing the cost of these things pencil out and compete with dirtier technologies, and that's a win on its own. And we've heard that center-right policies, when they have the right messengers, can actually protect, maybe not everything that we built, but it can protect core pieces of it. And so now we get into the part of what's not working, right? And there's a lot of reasons that climate policy is not working, right? You could say political polarization, culture wars. You could say the challenge inherent in climate change itself, which is cost today for benefits tomorrow. You could say all sorts of things. There's a lot of places we could go. So as someone who worked on the Inflation Reduction Act, worked in the Biden administration, I do have a lot of pain at this moment of like, okay, a lot of these things were like thoughtfully designed. We thought, okay, by driving these like carrot first strategy, the opposite of Waxman-Markey for people who are climate nerds, right? There was an attempt at one point to put a price on carbon, and it turned out everyone hated that. Then we said, well, why don't we do an all carrot approach? Well, like the IRA, let's just do tax credits and grants and make sure that people can get this stuff through. Now that was kind of largely repudiated. So I think figuring out what's next means that we have to figure out what didn't work. So this is open to anyone, whoever wants to get us started. From your perspective, what didn't work? What's not working right now?
So I think you brought up an important point, which is important to start with, which is that, and it's unfortunate that this is the case, but in many respects in our politics now, the details don't really matter. The policy design has become sort of second to the culture wars, the narratives, and how we sort of identify with these political parties and the messages that they put out. I think the challenge for the climate movement at this moment is reckoning with the fact that the climate movement has not become yet a successful and durable political movement. You can look at political movements, both sort of social movements and also ones that were anchored by legislation in the history of our country, including the very recent history. They became winning political movements because they were able to secure support from both sides. The statistics on this are very clear. Landmark legislation is rarely passed on a one-party basis. It rarely lasts if it is passed on a one-party basis. I think we have maybe one example in recent times of that being the case, which is President Obama's health care reform. So why is it that the climate movement has not been able to build that durable sort of support or even some support from the right? And I think it is important to say that there is a little bit of support for some of the policies in the Inflation Reduction Act from the right, but in terms of how the climate movement is broadly perceived in the American sort of public sphere, it is very much viewed as a left of center movement. The obvious answer that a lot of people in the climate movement give is it's the fossil fuel opposition and the interests and the financial interest that sort of is tied in with that. I think that's 100% part of the picture. If you look at the funding flows, the advocacy, the lobbying that comes from basically those who are opposed to climate action, it's significant. But it's not the full answer. And there's always going to be political opposition. There is on every single issue. Every constituency has an equal and opposing, or not always equal, but an opposing constituency to that issue. So you look at the climate movement today, I think one of the issues that it needs to confront is that I think the climate movement has become entangled with other constituencies and movements that are politically toxic to the right. You think of certain social justice movements which may or may not have very sort of strong moral sort of imperative behind them, but just are toxic to part of the country in terms of the way that they're communicated. I think that's an important issue to confront. You look at the way the environmental movement is structured, you have thousands of organizations with disparate sort of interests, policy goals, different constituencies that they're engaging. And then the philanthropy that supports those organizations, right, is also sort of disparate, disorganized, uncoordinated, whereas the opponents of climate action are much more organized, focused, and coordinated. And then the last point I'll bring up is that I think that there has not been a genuine effort in sort of the bureaucracy of the climate movement and with the funding to really empower right-of-center voices and constituencies. Less than 1% climate philanthropic flows go to organizations like Jessica and mine, which engage constituencies right of center. And so practically, in the way that the climate movement has spent its resources, and they are significant resources now, according to ClimateWorks, climate philanthropy has surpassed, I think, $15 billion per year. Just for comparison, the fossil fuel lobby spends between $300 and $500 million a year, depending on how you count it. So we have resources here. I think the question is, we need to figure out how to spend them in a way that creates real, durable political power, and that means spending them in a way that can get us some real allies on the right that can vote for the policies that we need.
Great, thanks, George. So we heard a little bit on kind of the cultural dimensions of climate policy and how it's perceived. And we heard a bit about, what is the opportunity in front of us and how do we organize around it? Who wants to go next? What's not working? Okay, Danny, go for it.
Yeah, I'd say one thing from the IRA that relates to charging and electric vehicles was, I think there was like something around $7 billion that was allocated to constructing EV chargers around the country. And you fast forward, 3-4 years, and there hasn't been that much charging infrastructure that's actually been built. So I think there's a implementation challenge. And it's not so much specific to climate, but it's just to like policy in general in the United States that I think is one constraint. Another challenge that we noticed both at Amazon, at Walmart, I also worked at a couple of startups selling into enterprises, was interpreting some of the complexity behind the IRA or some of the incentive work. Sometimes it required not only taking up a lot of resources from the legal department, from our tax and finance teams, but also hiring external consultants that kind of specialize in interpreting the rules. So not every company is an Amazon or a Walmart that has the resources to kind of put into that. So I think, the simplification piece, which I know is not easy to do, is another kind of bottleneck. And then I'll kind of take my West Texas, more local roots perspective of a lot of the folks that I grew up with, including like people my age now. They work in the oil and gas industry, and they have worked in it for 10, 15 years now. It's the source of their livelihood. Some of my friends back home have 1, 2, 3 kids, and they've worked in the oil and gas industry all their lives. When the issue that I want to kind of highlight is Democrats are anti-oil and gas, Republicans are pro-oil and gas. And to them, really the only issue that kind of gets them to vote if they do is, are you going to impact my livelihood or not? So I think the challenge is this us versus them mentality, and maybe reframing and not being so antagonistic against oil and gas as an industry, and saying, it's a core pillar of the economy. It probably will be for decades to come. It has negative externalities associated with them. How do we manage those? But in a way, extend an olive branch to a lot of these folks that the only thing they care about is their livelihood, feeding their kids, their family, and they don't have a whole lot of cushion to be in between jobs or a lot of time to upscale, rescale, and enter another industry. So I think that kind of us versus them is another challenge that I've noticed back home.
Yeah, so we've heard pace of implementation. Clearly, getting stuff done takes a while, and especially, designing new programs, making sure that they're compliant, and then actually getting the money out and implementing them. The IRA did not deliver quick enough, and so you had a lot of time where you could demonize what was happening because you couldn't see the positive benefit. And if you're taking a carrots-only approach, show me the carrots, right? Like you got to see it. And then when you did, it was really complicated. Like these complicated treasury tax documents people had to go through to figure out, do I even qualify? But then ultimately, kind of like with coal country, and IRA actually had money for folks in coal country, but like, how do you make sure that you're not attacking the people? You're saying we need to transition the industry.
Exactly.
So who wants to take us next? All right, Jessica.
I'll jump in, but more to kind of re-emphasize many points here, and I know Aruni also for yourself, but I do think, again, as you touch on that level of discourse, what was the discourse around this, especially with the vehicle of a hyper-partisan reconciliation bill to get the job done? What happened is we took what was under the hood many bipartisan policies, as well as policies that were originated and championed by Republicans, and pushed them through a partisan vehicle that, again, then soured and poisoned the policies themselves. And again, as we're looking at addressing a really urgent problem like climate, definitely understand the urgency of, hey, we can get this done in this way, let's push this through. But the risk was always going to be in choosing to do it that way instead of taking what would be a slower route, but not to do it in a bipartisan way. The risk was always that this could get dismantled. And also, I think what we also saw in the inception of the Inflation Reduction Act with that tone and discourse, some other elements of, again, as you said, that go-it-alone strategy and kind of writing off different constituencies, but even in our own work, we in the end were really working to support pushing the Inflation Reduction Act through. We're very instrumental in getting Senator Joe Manchin back to the negotiating table, but I can just tell you from what I witnessed even within the tone and tenor of the advocacy community, just even as he was slowing the process down, having some questions, working on that design, including for the oil and gas, the methane emissions reduction program that had both a carrot and a stick, put the first federal price on carbon that we ever had through that program on methane, which came with the carrot of grant funding for smaller producers to be able to institute the methane reduction technologies and approaches that were needed. But as those policies were being negotiated, witnessed firsthand kind of the vitriol and within the advocacy community as well. And so I think that's where, again, kind of toning down the rhetoric and finding ways to come together. And then I think, again, that second part is the benefits to real people and to their communities just simply didn't come fast enough. We're working with congregations right now through IRA-funded grant programs to plant trees in their communities to bring that life-giving shade to beat the heat. We're also working on a few other IRA grant-funded programs that, again, locally led, that have survived so far. But again, I don't think it could have been done faster. It's just simply kind of what the process that needed to take to get those things implemented into communities. But Aruni, I know this really is your area of expertise, and would love to pass it on to you.
Yeah, of course, thank you. Well, I hope I don't derail the conversation too much, but do it. So my perspective is just kind of the question of like what's not working. I think the issue, yes, of course, we can always tighten policies and make the tax credits, easier to use and get funding out the door faster to the right communities. Of course, we can make policy better, but I think the broader what's not working is the narrative that climate is political at all. At the very local level, it impacts everyone. It is impacting everyone. Everyone sees it in their day-to-day lives. And letting there even be a narrative that the right and left need to come together to do climate is not true. The reality is that it's not political. And we're like there's policies in the IRA that gave money to public schools to measure air quality in classrooms. Like, there's no one that could be opposed to that on a moral level. That's just basic humanity to let kids have clean air. So the fact that we're letting there be a narrative that this very effective policy it could be improved, but that it was not popular is just not true. And I think we need to move away from politicizing climate and just make it part of the reality of making people's lives better. And what we're seeing is just, this is where I'm getting derailed, but like vaccines were at once not seen political and now they are. Science was at some point not seen political and now it is. And clean air and clean water used to be a bipartisan supported policy, the Clean Air, Clean Water Act, that was basic human quality of life. And now we're seeing protections for clean air and clean water get stripped away. Everything seems to be on the chopping block for being partisan when it doesn't need to be. And we just need to push back against that and put the lives of people ahead of politics. And yeah, I think that's just the bigger issue, is that we're if we put people first, you won't see political pushback against those policies. And the more we make climate as a way to improve people's lives, the more we're going to see those policies be popular.
Yeah, and I hear that, right? I think the challenge of climate change is how political it can be made, right? For whatever purpose. It's one of those things, it's like when you focus on a kid who's having a heat stroke, it's a very straightforward thing to do, but it can easily be politicized and turned into a cultural issue, and then at that point, it's hard to come together when we do need to take, some pretty serious actions in the near term to protect our future. We have about 8-9 minutes left, and I want to spend some time thinking about what's next. And as the state person on this panel, I'm really excited about what you can do at the state level. Obviously, one of the reasons we've made so much progress on climate change has been, cities and states leading the way, creating markets that eventually the federal government tries to build around. That happened in Massachusetts under Governor Romney with Romney Care, which became Obamacare. Like, states do actually come up with all sorts of things and try them out. And so I'm hopeful, as someone who has started a job in the state 4 weeks ago, hopeful that we get to do some of that work. But I'm interested in, from your perspective, help us see the future. What's coming? What programs, policies, what would you do? How would you, if you had the money or if you had a new coalition, how would you move us forward? Because right now it's not working, clearly. So what's next? Jessica, can we start with you?
Sure. And I think, as we've discussed here, we don't have at heart a policy or technology problem. I think, again, amazing ideas are coming out of, we've got amazing ideas. Yes, we need to do some tweaks and refinements there. But again, it really at heart is solving this politics and cultural issue. And so, what I think needs to happen, and again, I think that this moment that we find ourselves in underscores that the urgency of solving this problem, of the cultural problem, the politics. And so definitely, I think at this stage, if I had unlimited resources, I would be out there mobilizing the messengers from the inside, from local communities, rural communities, faith communities, conservative communities, the folks who have the ear of the Republican Party and others that are making influential decisions, making sure that everyone sees the stake, their personal stake in climate and the benefits they will see in solving it. That's where I'd really put our resources towards, of making that personal case to everyone.
All right, who's feeling brave? Who's next? What's next for us? Danny?
I was going to say, from like a technology perspective, on the EV front specifically, like the technology is kind of there. It just needs to scale up, and maybe some investment into solid state batteries, which would kind of help us bridge the last kind of more technical edge cases for that. But outside of the technology piece, and to kind of tie into the people first and the grassroots level thinking, is Texas produces the most amount of wind energy anywhere in the country. Texas also historically has been an oil and gas state, one of the, if not the highest producing oil and gas state in the country. This year, they also surpassed California a few times on solar energy production, and that's probably going to continue to happen. So tying that back to the West Texas angle and a lot of the folks that I grew up with, there's been a small amount of folks that I know that have transitioned into building wind farms, into building solar and storage. and whether they're immigrants such as myself from Mexico or other places, I've noticed a shift in how they think about how they vote, and it's much less to that us versus them mentality. It's much less about that, and it's much more about they start talking about other issues outside of just who is pro-oil or not. Like immigration starts to become more important. So I think upskilling is kind of an easy win, because a lot of the skills that folks that have applied that apply to the coal industry or the oil and gas industry and to work in these environments, it's not a big jump to then go work at a solar farm or a wind farm. It does require some upskilling. So if I could focus on anything, it would be programs around that where you can kind of give folks an easy way out and paint a future for what's the industries of tomorrow and what are going to continue to have positive outcomes, not only for society, but also for yourself and your family.
Great. Thanks, Danny.
Yeah, I will say what's next. Prepare. Get people money to flood-proof their basements and get small business owners the resources to make an adaptation plan for how to protect their their stock when, or their products when there's going to be a flood. Just really resource the public to make the changes they need in their lives to run their businesses, live their lives, get to school and work, and be healthy. And I think when you have those kinds of protections for the climate impacts that people are seeing, when people are living well, then, I don't think this election was won or lost because of the IRA. I don't think people said, oh no, that's the reason I'm not voting for XYZ person. I think people vote a certain way based on the quality of life. And if you improve quality of life, A, that's the right thing to do, that's the moral thing to do. But then B, as a side effect, the political environment might shift in a way that might support your policies as well. So I think, I guess what I've been saying is, just to support communities.
Great. Thank you, Aruni. George.
Yes. In terms of what's next, I would say we need to have some tough conversations about building and empowering new messengers who can get us support on the political right. I think there's no pathway forward continuing to do the same. And by continuing to do the same, I think that means funding the same organizations, working on the same exact policies or policy designs, or continuing to think that the way we talk about climate, even on a very fundamental base level, is going to work to get us to where we need. Because the reality is, right, one thing we haven't talked about today vis-a-vis the IRA is that even if the IRA had been implemented perfectly with every dollar spent the way it was supposed to, we're still losing the battle on climate. I mean, we are not on a trajectory right now that we're going to meet the emissions goals that we need to avoid the worst impacts. And so we need so much more. And I continue to think that on a problem of this scale, it's a physics problem. The highest leverage, not that there are other things that are not important, but the highest leverage thing is getting additional federal policy action. And in order to do that, there's just no other pathway. It needs to be bipartisan. And so we should put a heavy premium on any type of work, any type of activity, any organization, any messenger that can get us greater support on the political right. And I would say we just need to put so much more attention into that, because it'll help us defend what's already there, and it'll help illuminate the pathway in terms of what's possible next, whether that's permitting reform, whether that is someday a price on carbon. I mean, whatever it might be, figuring out where the political space is for those sorts of things is, I think, the key.
Great. So, we've heard today lots of different perspectives on where we could be going. I'm sure in this room, there's a ton of perspectives as well on where we can be going. The one thing I want to leave us with as we close today is just, as my phone's about to beep, you know, climate's a space that can get depressing really quick. I think one thing Jessica noted was just that, like, the sense of urgency behind climate is so real that sometimes it makes it feel like you can't choose another path because we don't have enough time. And there's plenty of truth in that, right? We're seeing impacts today already. So when you know the clock's ticking and you have to get really complicated things done, it makes it even more important to do it right. And so I hope all of you can like hold that in the climate space, that it's complex, it's urgent, it's we keep trying, and it's really hard. It feels like things sometimes aren't going to work, but sometimes things do work, right? Sometimes it just takes a couple of attempts. So thank you for sitting with us today, and thank you to our panelists.